Nazi Germany's fleet of U-boats were a formidable force during the Second World War, and particularly in the first 3 years of the war. Much has been made of the so-called Battle of the Atlantic that U-boats waged against Allied vessels, and rightly so. However, less known and appreciated is just how successful U-boats were in the Caribbean Sea. Even less known is how a handful of Italian submarines also played their part in sinking Allied ships in the Caribbean. In this video, we'll explore just what those few Italian submarines were about and what they achieved. To commence, we need context. So, what was the Caribbean region like at the outbreak of the Second World War? Well, let's just say that things were pretty quiet for a while. In the words of a United States Navy Online article, the outbreak of war in Europe, September 1st, 1939, caused scarcely a ripple in the broad expanse of the Caribbean. Yep, things were relatively peaceful in the Caribbean. In those early months of the war, U-boats were wreaking carnage in the North Atlantic and English Channel. And so, down in the Caribbean, cargo ships came and went as they pleased, as did oil tankers going and to and from the oil fields of Venezuela. The same could be said for the nearby Panama Canal. All this trade was critical to keeping the Allied war machine going in the face of relentless Axis aggression, especially at a time when the United States was still theoretically neutral. The Allies assumed that peace would come to an end in the Caribbean when the Germans invaded the Netherlands on May 10, 1940. That's because the Dutch owned territory in the Caribbean, which was critical to the Caribbean trade routes. In response, the Free Dutch government in exile made sure to immediately order all German and Italian residents of the Netherlands West Indies to an internment camp. The camp was located on the island of Bonaire in the Netherlands Antilles, which is close to the more well-known Isle of Curaçao. Even the wife of the governor's secretary, who happened to be Austrian, was interned. On the very next day, May 11th, the British invaded both Curaçao and Aruba, just in case the Germans decided to seize those two Dutch-owned islands. After all, Aruba was home to the Lago refinery, which was at the time the largest oil refinery in the world. It was even larger than the oil refineries that the Japanese would go on to famously seize in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies in early 1942. The Allies knew it was only a matter of time before the Germans turned their attention to the Caribbean, or at least that's what they assumed. For whatever reason, the Germans didn't come storming into the Caribbean region as expected. By mid-February 1942, World War II had already been raging for nearly 30 months, and yet not a single ship had been torpedoed by a U-boat in the Caribbean. Yet the Allies remained on high alert, waiting for fleets of U-boats to come hunting in Caribbean waters. Everything did indeed change on February 16, 1942. At less than 2 hours after midnight, German U-boats appeared off the Dutch islands of Curaçao and Aruba, as well as at the entrance to Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela. Before even sunrise, the U-boats had torpedoed no less than 7 tankers, while the refinery at Aruba was shelled. By daybreak, the U-boats had destroyed 10% of Aruba's tanker fleet. The long-awaited Battle of the Caribbean had finally begun. To say the campaign was a huge success for Germany is a massive understatement. U-boats successfully torpedoed 263 ships within the Caribbean and its approaches, with a total tonnage of 1,362,278 tons of shipping. The Battle of the Caribbean lasted from February 16, 1942 to November 30, 1942, or 41 weeks in total. That means U-boats were sinking an average of 6 Allied ships a week during the campaign, or almost 1 a day on average. That is hugely impressive for any naval campaign. Want another impressive stat regarding the U-boat fleet in the Caribbean? U-boats sank more ships in the Caribbean than on the famous North Atlantic convoy routes, the Eastern Sea Frontier, and the Canadian Coastal Zone combined. In June 1942 alone, 48 Allied ships were sunk in the Caribbean region by German U-boats. A close second was August of 1942, with a tally of 46 enemy ships sunk. Operation Newland, as it was codenamed by the Germans, had been a terrific success. It was only on August 27, 1942, that an American amphibious aircraft and Canadian corvette were together able to sink a U-boat, U-94, off the coast of Cuba. That's more than 6 months after the Germans had entered the Caribbean arena. But German submarines were not alone in their attacks on Allied shipping in the Caribbean. They had an Axis partner eager to assist with their own submarines in the region. Enter the Italians. Although nowhere on the scale of Germany's U-boat fleet, Italy still had a sizable submarine fleet. Unlike other navies, Italian submarines were not released as classes, but rather as types or categories of submarines. The Italian submarine fleet consisted of 10 classes of ocean-going submarines, namely the Archimede, Balilla, Brin, Cagni, Calvi, Glauco, Fieramosca, Liuzzi, Marcello, and Marconi. There were also 7 classes of medium-sized submarines and 5 for smaller submarines made for Mediterranean or coastal patrols. Additionally, there were 3 classes of mine-laying submarines, 2 for midget submarines and 1 for transport submarines. Although, once again, not as impressive a tally as that by German U-boats, Italian submarines still had success in the Atlantic, in which they sank a total of 109 ships. Italian crews had greatly benefited from training at a submarine school in Gotenhofen, Germany, done in cooperation with Germany's Kriegsmarine. Italy's Atlantic fleet of submarines also benefited greatly from their purpose-built base known as Beta Somme, located in the German-occupied French river port city of Bordeaux. You should check out our video about that Italian submarine base, as well as our videos on both the Italian commanders at Beta Somme, namely Angelo Perona and Romolo Polacchini. It's fascinating stuff. There was a quintet of Italian submarines that assisted German U-boats as part of Operation Newland. They mostly patrolled the Atlantic side of the Lesser Antilles Islands group in the Eastern Caribbean, which comprises islands such as Puerto Rico, Barbados, Aruba, Curaçao, the British Virgin Islands, and U.S. Virgin Islands, as well as the French territories of Martinique and Guadeloupe. All 5 of the Italian submarines left their base at Beta Somme in Bordeaux in order to meet up with their U-boat counterparts in the Caribbean. The 5 Italian submarines were the Giuseppe Finzi, Leonardo da Vinci, Morosini, Enrico Tazzoli, and Luigi Torelli. All 5 Italian subs scored hits during their time in the Eastern Caribbean, while also taking time to divert and score hits nearer to Brazil in the Southern Atlantic, as well as in the North Atlantic to and from their patrols. We'll concentrate on the 3 most successful of these 5 Italian submarines in terms of their number of successful sinkings in the Battle of the Caribbean. First, the Morosini. This sub of the Marcello class had been substantially upgraded to make her way to the Caribbean, including a redesign of her interior compartments, allowing her to increase her torpedoes to 16. She also had her ballast tanks modified to take on more fuel. She arrived in an area to the northeast of the island of Guadeloupe in the early part of February 1942. Unfortunately, she was so overloaded with fuel that she could barely reach knots, which is why the British cargo ship Saguenay was able to elude the Morosini on February 23rd. It was on March 11th that she got her first Caribbean hit. It was the 5,966-ton British cargo ship, the Stangarth, which she sank with a single torpedo. Not much is known about this sinking, but it was a sign that Italian subs could get the job done in the busy lanes around the Antilles. 4 days later, on the night of March 15, 1942, it was the turn of a Dutch motor tanker to be struck by the Morosini about 100 miles to the north of Bermuda. She was the 6,341-ton Oscilla, and this time it took 3 of 5 torpedoes fired by the Morosini to finally sink this vessel, as well as a few 100mm shells for good measure. The Morosini's third and final successful sinking in her Caribbean mission would be of the Pater Bogan, a British tanker which at 9,741 tons was the largest ship she sank in the region. The British tanker eventually succumbed and sank in the early hours of March 24th after being hit by 2 torpedoes from the Italian sub. The Morosini would eventually disappear after losing radio contact just 50 miles from the French coast. She was on her way back to base at the end of her 3rd patrol. No one can exactly account for how or where she disappeared. The second of our submarines is the Giuseppe Finzi, which started off its Caribbean mission on a very bad note. It suffered a serious failure of one of its exhaust manifold's shut-off valves, which lasted 4 days. The crew then discovered that both periscopes had failed, never mind that the forward planes which are used to control depth were also malfunctioning badly. However, even with these critical failures, the Giuseppe Finzi was still able to track down and sink the French tanker, the Melpomese, using 4 of its torpedoes to do so. Thankfully for the French vessel, all 49 men on board were able to be rescued before their ship finally sank. That took place on March 7th. Just a few hours later, the Giuseppe Finzi intercepted another ship, this time a Swedish steamship, the Skane. The 4,528-ton Swedish vessel, which had recently had its name changed to Boren, took 3 torpedoes and some deck gun fire to sink it. Once again, all of the crew members hit by the Giuseppe Finzi, this time 36 of them, were able to be rescued. On March 10th, the Italian sub was relocated to transfer fuel to one of her sister subs, the Morosini. It was during this refueling that the crew of the Giuseppe Finzi caught sight of a nearby tanker, the Norwegian tanker, Charles Racine. It was a sizable tanker, coming in at 10,000 tons. The Giuseppe Finzi took aim, fired 6 torpedoes, and the Norwegian ship sank almost immediately. Even so, and quite incredibly, all 46 crew on the Norwegian ship were rescued. You were certainly lucky if you were in the Caribbean in March 1942 and hit by torpedoes from the Giuseppe Finzi, because you were guaranteed of surviving the hit even if your ship didn't. Our third sub, the Enrico Tazzoli, was the most successful of all 5 Italian submarines, sinking 6 Allied ships from 5 different nations in just 9 days. She had left her base in February 1942 at Bordeaux with the destination of the south coast of Florida. From there, she headed south. Her first successful hit would be on March 6th, when she located and sank the Dutch steamer, Astria. Coincidentally, March 6th was a particularly awful day for the Netherlands. No less than approximately 22 Dutch Royal Navy and merchant ships were either bombed, torpedoed, or scuttled due to heavy damage on that day. Many of them in fierce battles with the Japanese in the Dutch East Indies. In the meantime, the Enrico Tazzoli carried on its merry way and sank the Norwegian motor ship, Tonsberg Fjord, on that very same night. That happened approximately 200 nautical miles or 370 kilometers to the west of Bermuda. 2 days later, on March 8th, the Italian sub would hit and sink its third freighter, this one from Uruguay, and named after its capital city, Montevideo. The Uruguayan ship suffered 14 casualties, the most of any of the 6 ships sunk in the Caribbean by the Enrico Tazzoli. And 2 days after that, on March 10th, it was another freighter, this time from Greece and named Signet, that would be sunk by the Italian sub, albeit with no casualties. That was followed by the British freighter, the Daytonian, on March 13th, with just 1 torpedo needed to sink her. The 6th and final sinking by the Enrico Tazzoli in the Caribbean would also be its largest hit, the 8,780-ton British tanker, the Athol Queen. That was on March 15, 1942. She would return to her base in Bordeaux in German-occupied France at the end of March, remaining there until the 1st of June for badly needed repairs. As for the other 2 submarines in the quintet of Italian submarines, they each scored 2 successful sinkings. The Leonardo da Vinci sank the Cabedelo on February 25th, which was a vessel belonging to Brazil, a nation that was actually neutral in the war. Tragically, all men on the Brazilian ship lost their lives. A second ship, the Everasma, a freighter from Latvia, was sunk 3 days later on February 25th. Of the 2 Italian subs that sank 2 ships, the Luigi Torelli sank larger ships in terms of tonnage. The first was the 7,300-ton British freighter, the Scottish Star, which sank on February 19th, followed 6 days later by the Panamanian vessel, the Esso Copenhagen, a 9,200-ton tanker. As we've seen, these 5 Italian submarines were not in the Caribbean arena for that long, with most of their successes occurring in February and March of 1942. Germany's U-boats were there for longer and in far greater numbers. Yet the Italian submarines did their part in what is yet another fascinating chapter of submarine warfare in the Second World War.